I'm Lisa Bruggeman. Kirsten Bruggeman is my daughter. Kirsten is our only daughter. It's January 1st, 2021. Kirsten is working a shift at a pizza restaurant. I told her, I'll pick you up tonight. I said, just let me know about when, because she was closing. She came back with a text that said, I'm going to meet some friends. So I had texted back and said, be careful, be good. And she said, I will. I woke up around midnight, look at my phone, see there's nothing there from Kirsten. I text her, are you okay? I get no response. I call her. Her phone goes directly to voicemail. I'm laying in bed, but I'm certainly not sleeping. I continue probably about every 10 minutes to call Kirsten with no response. At this point, I'm worried. I just know something is wrong. Call it mother's intuition. I know something bad is happening. Kirsten will be 28 in just a couple of weeks. She'd always been very intelligent, but she just kind of lost her way, I think, in high school. Some issues with grades, but she still graduated with honors. Kirsten has lived with us for the last year. She didn't have a car. I had to be taking her back and forth to work.
They say I'm a menace. If you don't know Dennis.
She is a force. Can be stubborn. And I think I can say that from the very beginning, because when I went into labor with her, she was actually sitting. She didn't want to come out, and so I had to have a C-section. She's not an angel, but she's our angel.
I'm Rex Bruggeman. I'm Kirsten Bruggeman's father. She was just an ordinary American girl. She loved to have fun. Kirsten is a very loving person that enjoyed life.
I did work for the Marion County Probation Department. Rex was working for the Justice Department through Marion County. He then later joined probation. We were married while we were both at the probation department. We live in Indiana, in a suburb called Lawrence. It's a little incorporated town. It does have some issues, but the schools have a good reputation and it's a good place. Saturday morning, Kirsten is still not home. Her phone is still off. I decide to contact Eddie. Kirsten is very secretive about her friends and who she's with. So we did not know many of her actual friends other than Eddie.
I'm Eddie, Kirsten Bruggeman's ex-boyfriend. And I was with Kirsten Bruggeman the night she disappeared. Kirsten and I dated for about 10 years off and on. We weren't together anymore. We were just friends, but we kind of still, once a week, we'd go do something. That night, Kirsten calls me. She says, hey, it's New Year's. Let's go out and do something. I get off of work around, I want to say 10 o'clock, 10:30, and my plan is to actually meet Kirsten and some friends at a bar.
I message Eddie to ask if he knows where Kirsten is.
And I responded, no, I expected her to be home. So her mother says, well, she's not here.
He messages back that he was with her the night before with some friends at a bar that previous evening. And She took off and he didn't know where she had gone. I tell him that her phone is off and I can't reach her and that I'm really getting scared.
I didn't quite understand what had happened, but I kind of figured that maybe they had an argument and Kirsten went her way and they went their way. But what I couldn't understand is why Kirsten didn't contact us to come get her, or why even Eddie didn't call us.
I immediately went out and started retracing anywhere and everywhere I thought she would be. Everything from dumpster areas to weird alleys, and then asking anyone and everyone if they'd seen her, seen anything, heard anything.
It's about an hour later, around 11:40 a.m., he messages back and says that he looked around and he could not find her. I was almost sick to my stomach. Something bad has really happened.
My wife said, "Kirsten's still not home. I'm having a bad feeling about this." And I tell her, maybe she shut her phone off, maybe she misplaced her phone, maybe the battery went dead, just give it a little more time.
At about 3:30, I called the pizza restaurant where she worked because I knew that she was scheduled to work that afternoon. I talked with the owner-manager who said Kirsten had not shown up, nor had there been any contact from her.
Kirsten, she very rarely missed work unless she had a very good reason.
Okay. Kirsten has a dog, Tifa. She is the sweetest dog. Kirsten just loved her.
Kirsten always loved animals. That's one of the things that makes me believe that she did not disappear or go missing voluntarily. She never would have left her dog.
Lawrence Police.
Yes, I need to report my daughter missing.
It was about 5 a.m. on Sunday morning, January 3rd, when I called the Indianapolis Metro Police Department to make a missing persons report.
What's her first and last name?
Her first name is Kirsten, and last name Bruggeman.
I think calling the police and making that report made it extremely real.
It just seemed surrealistic to me that my wife is actually on the phone calling the police to report our daughter missing. The feeling in the pit of your stomach when you know something's happened to one of your children, you don't know what, and there's nothing that you can do. That helpless feeling, it made me sick,
When's the last time you heard from her?
Friday night, about 10 o'clock. Nobody has heard from her or seen her. She didn't show up to work. Just no contact at all.
The police took all that information and indicated it would be assigned to a detective the following day on Monday. And that it seemed like the longest wait ever.
So we decided to go out and find our daughter ourselves. Nothing else matters until we get this solved.
On Monday, January 4th, Rex and I decide to drive over to the bar where she was last seen and look around the surrounding area.
We began walking along here, just trying to see if there was anything at all that would be a clue to what happened to her, to see if we could find something that belonged to her or her clothing. This is the mattress I found when we were walking that day, and I had this fear that I was going to find something under there I didn't want to see. But I picked it up. Fortunately, there was nothing under there. That's when one thing in particular caught my eye, and that was like a drainage ditch. This is a rather lengthy stretch of drainage ditch, so we had a little bit of area to cover, and at one point we split. I was over there on the north side, Lisa was over here on the south side, and we're walking along, looking down into the water. And immediately I remember thinking, oh God, you know, if somebody did something terrible to her, that would probably, to me anyway, would be a logical place to ditch a body. This is basically what I did that day. I just picked up stuff and moved it, turning things over. I had a stick and I was poking around, looking in the water. It was a really eerie feeling. I was scared. I was afraid that I was going to find something I didn't want to see. I was hoping I could find something, and yet I didn't want to find something. I remember that sickening feeling that, what am I going to do if I look down and I see my daughter? So on Monday, January 4th, my wife and I, we spent quite a bit of time searching that drainage ditch.
We were hoping for any kind of clues as to what happened to our daughter, Kirsten.
I'm worried that she actually could have, you know, either fallen into it, that, or she could have met with someone that did her harm and, you know, left her there. Just thinking about that made me sick.
But we did not find anything. It was frustrating and disappointing. After we had looked around the drainage ditch, Rex and I were heading to the car, and I see somebody on a bicycle coming our way. As the bicycle gets closer, I realize it's Eddie. He says he's there to look for Kirsten. I was upset. I wondered if Eddie had anything to do with Kirsten's disappearance.
So I'm talking to Eddie, and I want to know more details as to what actually happened that evening. So he kind of laid it out for me. They were all in the bar, and they were drinking. I believe they were fighting, and he was getting a little perturbed. They offered to take her home, but she did not want any part of that.
I am upset that he left her there. Kirsten and Eddie have been together off and on for about 10 years. Their relationship, I think, has always been a little tumultuous. They seem to get along well and do things together, but then something will happen and one of them blows up at the other, and then it's off to the races again. I tried to tell them that I thought that their relationship had been worn out, but Kirsten believed she really loved Eddie, and she just wasn't going to let go.
Kirsten's mom was more emotional than Rex was. Rex was just more or less stern. At this point, I'm not really concerned about how they're looking at me. I just kind of went into just frantic mode. I'm like, where's Kirsten? Let's just find Kirsten. I love her dearly.
The only hope we could hold on to was that the police could get this solved.
I'm Detective Nicole Bochting with the IMPD Missing Persons Unit, and I was assigned to investigate the Kirsten Brueggemann case. When I first read Kirsten's report, I immediately felt that there was something wrong. Her phone was turned off. That was a big red flag. But even more so, it was the fact that she didn't show up to work. Learning that Kirsten would never leave her dog behind leads me to believe that she did not leave on purpose. I learned that Kirsten was with 4 other people that night. And I was able to track down who they were. Kirsten and Eddie and her friends, and they were all drinking, and she had a little too much to drink.
Kirsten did have an issue with alcohol. Both her dad and I, we were concerned about her drinking. We talked with her numerous times, but she would just say, I don't want to talk about it, and she'd walk out. And that was always frustrating for her dad and I. She got angry quickly. She would almost explode.
It was particularly hard for me because I am a recovered alcoholic, and to see my daughter go through the same struggles that I had. I told her, you see what alcohol did to your father. Why would you want to take that chance and, suffer through all that? But her usual response was, Dad, just because everybody drinks, it doesn't make them an alcoholic. She just would not admit that she had any kind of a problem. Well, finally, we seek professional advice and get her in to see a psychiatrist. That did help, but ultimately, she did not want to go anymore. But just before she disappeared, she seemed to be putting her life back together again. We were really hopeful that things were going to get a little bit better.
I don't know why Kirsten was drinking that night, but she got drunk. So we were like, hey, we gotta get you home and everything. Hey, can I get you an Uber? Let me call your mom or whatever.
The bar was closing anyhow, so they left around 12:15. So out in the parking lot, for some reason, Kirsten became angry, and at one point, a verbal argument ensues. All four friends drove off, leaving Kirsten in the parking lot.
I assumed, hey, maybe she got an Uber, or maybe she finally called her mom. But she never made it home.
The first thing I wonder is, are there any cameras in the area? And just went down the line and started calling them, asking for a possible video. And I got 3 videos. The first video, I was extremely excited to view the video because I wanted to know what happened to Kirsten. The video, it showed Kirsten having a verbal argument out in the parking lot, and then in the car driving away. The video confirmed everything that was told to me by the 4 people, and it was determined that none of them were a person of interest. Viewing the video, I found that there weren't any cars in the parking lot that she got into. She didn't meet with anybody. She didn't walk off with anybody. It just shows her walking off. After Kirsten leaves the bar, the second video shows Kirsten walking on Short Ridge around 12:40 a.m. The last video is of Kirsten walking in the YMCA parking lot. And here's Kirsten right now. She's walking along the sidewalk, and she'll go into this niche, follow this fence line right through here. If you notice right here, it says 159. So we know at 159, Kirsten's still alive. Once Kirsten rounds this corner, this particular camera does not pick her up. Another camera, however, picks her up right here at this corner. She's walking along the fence line. She picks up something off the ground and she continues to walk. Right here, it says 2 a.m. And as we watch the video, she continues to walk and she continues to stay along with the fence line. What's problematic about the video is that there's a glitch. And there's going to be a jump in time here shortly where it shows that the camera is not working. Right here you see it's 2 a.m. and now it's 2:30 a.m. And right there, she's gone. She's not seen again. It's a very big disappointment. This time jump from 2 to 2:30 a.m. concerns me because we don't know what happened. We don't know where she went. No one could figure out why, but for some reason, the camera just cut out for that half hour. It was just an unfortunate glitch. Did she leave the parking lot on foot in this direction? Did a car come in, pick her up, and take her back out? I just don't know.
Detective Bakhtin asked us to review the video to see if that was Kirsten.
There was no doubt it was Kirsten, just by the way she was walking, plus the white backpack that she was carrying. That stood out like a sore thumb.
Watching that video was very difficult. I'm wondering if that's the last we're going to see her. All I can do is wonder, where is she? Where did she go? I'm afraid. I'm very afraid.
The area that Kirsten went missing in, which is in the 800 block of Short Ridge, is a high violent crime area. Within a week or two after her missing, there was a rape, a homicide, and the homicide involved a bank robber.
If she was trying to get home, she should have been going the other direction. But maybe she's totally mixed up and thinks she's going to the apartment complex where Eddie was living with his mom, which is a couple blocks north of there. But we may never know.
There's 3 different buildings in between my apartments and the Y. If Kirsten was coming to see me, she would be going the wrong way. But anything is possible. She could have just been lost.
I decided to go to the location where Kirsten was last seen on the cameras. This yellow pole is to where she got, and then she makes her left-hand turn here, and she goes out of view of the camera for a short time period. Enough time period for her to get down to where this big black pole is, because over here, we now have another camera. This other camera shows the east end of the Abbey apartment complex. So she comes back into view. She's still walking along the same line, and she continues this way. She just continues around over there. Now she's going to be walking southbound towards the apartment complex. She makes this turn right here, and that's it. With the camera shorting out, we can't see if she ever walks out of the parking lot, and we can't see if a car drives into the parking lot, and she gets into a car, and we can't see if she ever climbs over the fence. I mean, she vanished. I noticed that there's a lot of activity at the Abbey Apartments. So we wanted to knock on doors over there. So we got a group of us together, the missing person unit, and we started knocking on doors and talking to people. We have Kirsten's poster with us. We show the poster to the people. Hopefully, maybe somebody there might have seen something. But due to the high crime area, somebody in the Abbey apartment complex may know something, but they're just too scared to come forward and tell the police about what they know. A couple weeks into the investigation, I sit down with Kirsten's parents to update them on the investigation.
As I'm sitting in Detective Bakhtin's office, I'm thinking now that something bad has happened. She has met with foul play. But we had no proof.
I'm even more scared as time goes on. This is not going to have a good ending. But I have a lot of good friends and family who keep saying, try to keep the hope up. And so I am. My good friend, who also works within the law enforcement community, had arranged for there to be a search. On Saturday, January 16th, around the area where Kirsten went missing, there was a grid search conducted. Rex and I are there. It was difficult watching people go out. It was difficult watching them come back, especially because there was nothing that was actually found. I do want to find an answer. I am also afraid of that answer.
We want closure for the family. We all care deeply because we put ourselves in their position, and it's just heartbreaking when your head is pounding up against a wall and you're not getting anywhere. At this point, our leads, they're running out. We've done everything that we could do. We used our mounted unit and drone to search for Kirsten. We went and canvassed the area. We put her face on social media. We put her in the news. We put her face on billboards on the interstate. There's not much left for us to do other than to wait for somebody to call and say, hey, I saw her here. I saw her there.
Every day seems like the last one because nothing is happening as far as finding our daughter.
If there is someone out there that knows something, please put yourself in her dad's and my shoes. This has been agony for us. We just want to know what happened.
Kirsten Bruggeman was last seen January 2nd, 2021. If you have any information, please contact IMPD Missing Persons Unit at 317-327-6160.
It's been about 6 weeks since Kirsten was missing, and I saw a posting on a Facebook site that an unidentified female had been found. The general description fit Kirsten.
The same weight, approximately 114, 115 pounds. The height was within an inch or two of Kirsten, and the hair color was the same. And my wife and I had kind of convinced ourselves that this body that was found, which had not been identified, was our daughter. We were almost to the point of grieving.
But the one thing that stood out was that this body had a tattoo of a spider on her arm. Kirsten did not have a tattoo that I was aware of, but because the description so closely fit her, I contacted Detective Bochting and the coroner's office to ask more about this.
And then the weeks we were waiting to hear from the coroner's office, that was a pretty trying time. In one respect, we wanted it to be her so we could have some closure, but on the other's hand, we didn't want it to be her, so that we still had hope that she was still alive.
When DNA is returned, it's confirmed that it was not Kirsten. So there is still hope that she is still alive.
I'm happy at the time, but then I'm also feeling like we're back to square one. In March of 2021, I bring up the possibility of a private investigator to Rex. By hiring a private investigator, we'll have somebody who can devote the whole time to her case.
When Lisa and Rex told me, I was extremely happy because for me, I don't care who solves the case, I just want her to come home.
My name is Crystal. I am a private investigator. The Bergman family contacted me early March of 2001 to help find Kirsten. I've been in law enforcement for approximately 11 years. My specialty is missing persons and criminal investigations. I have about a 90% success rate in finding individuals. So when I first met with Lisa and Rex Bergerman, they were definitely desperate for answers, and they just wanted to know what happened to Kirsten. My first few days were actually spent just canvassing the area, talking to people that would have offered insight as to what happened. I had to actually backtrack and look at surveillance video from the night she went missing. What I did notice is there's a fence line that closes the YMCA lot off. And then there's an apartment community on the south end of the YMCA. That's the Abbey Meadow Apartments. The next thing is that, you know, and understanding that there are 4 different angles on these surveillance videos, it's just running through them numerous times for weeks on end just to see if there's any new evidence that we can uncover that we had not seen before. And then one thing that I did observe was an SUV, and about 2:38, you see it come out of the Abbey Meadow Apartments. It proceeds north on Shortridge, and then approximately 3:15 a.m., you see the same SUV traveling north on Shortridge, and then proceeds back down Shortridge. The behavior of that vehicle was definitely suspicious. At that point, I'm thinking that this person may have picked her up. Something could have happened. We actually did continue surveillance to see if that vehicle had any association to the Abbey Apartments and if they lived there. But we didn't see the vehicle show up at the Abbey Meadows Apartments again. The picture of the SUV is out to the public in addition to flyers of Kirsten's story, and we're hoping to get answers.
Once Crystal began with her investigation, she was able to obtain a couple of videos that showed this car, we believed was an SUV, that had left the Abbey Apartments, seemed to be just driving around, would stop and start. You could see the brake lights come on and go off. The thought was perhaps that SUV was somehow involved with Kirsten's disappearance.
So this could be a very big break. I need to find out who owns this vehicle, who was driving the vehicle. This means that we could have a suspect. About 2 weeks later, there's nothing. No leads. There was nothing useful revealed. But we are partners with the FBI, and they knew that Kirsten had went missing. The FBI agent saw the video that we retrieved from the business across from the Abbey apartment complex and was able to say, I know who owns that vehicle. I found out that it was actually linked to a homicide that had occurred over in that apartment complex. Working with the FBI, I was able to identify the SUV. Crime Lab was called to do testing on the vehicle, and they were able to eliminate totally that Kirsten was inside that vehicle.
September of 2021, the case was, in fact, getting pretty cold. So we talked about hosting a vigil for Kirsten.
There had been no leads at this point in Kirsten's disappearance. It was frustrating and disappointing. We held a vigil for Kirsten on Saturday, September 18th. We were hoping to draw a lot of people from the neighborhood who possibly come forward with some information.
The private investigator contacted us and said that possibly we can get some media attention, get her name out there some more. It meant a great deal to Lisa and I. It really buoyed our emotions.
So we did get quite a few leads that came immediately after we hosted the vigil, but those were all exhausted and didn't lead anywhere.
But this time, no one has come forward. And that's what's been very discouraging about this, is nothing. For my wife and I, it's been a roller coaster of emotions.
One of the biggest fears is that we may never know what happened to her.
We're to the point where now we have to sit and wait for somebody to come to us and tell us, hey, we saw something.
March of 2022, a lead came in out of Franklin, Indiana, at a bar, and the patron actually called local law enforcement and just advised that they believed that a female in the bar that was accompanied by a male was possibly Kirsten.
I'm thinking, this is great. Finally, we've got a break in the case. Through a series of efforts and phone calls, we got a hold of the video. And we watched that video, and man, it does look like her. It was a good quality video, although you couldn't really get a good direct-on look at her.
And as we were watching, I had to keep telling myself, does this really look like her, or am I wanting it so much that I'm thinking it looks like her? But then we noticed something on the video that looked a little odd.
This woman is acting rather strange in this video. She's kind of bent over. Her affect is very weird. She's not showing any emotion. When she walks, it's like she's almost like a robot. So that part of it, I was alarmed by.
My initial thought is, if this is her, she's been brainwashed, because the way this woman was in the video was not Kirsten. It was not her personality.
I believe that someone knows something. I feel very hopeful that we can find out what happened to Kirsten and find some answers for the family.
I believe that someone saw something that evening or early morning when Kirsten went missing. I just can't believe that no one saw anything.
There were points in time during all of this where I wondered if Eddie had anything to do with Kirsten's disappearance. They had a volatile relationship. However, I do not think that Eddie had anything to do with it.
This thought that Eddie might be responsible just popped into my head, I guess because of their on-again, off-again relationship, all the problems that they had had. It was just a thought, a passing thought. I am 99.9% sure he had nothing to do with Kirsten's disappearance.
My relationship with Kirsten, it was a good relationship. And I have good memories. I have the sad ones. With her being gone, I don't know how to feel anymore. And I've went through every range of emotion about this. But now I'm emotionally numb about it. You can only do so much to take care of people, and some things are within your control.
Keeping my hope up has been difficult. Both Rex and I we've just been existing for this year plus now. We've had to keep putting one foot in front of the other.
When this happened, it just felt like the life was sucked out of me. Things just stopped. I've lost loved ones. Everyone has lost loved ones, family, friends. But when someone's gone missing and you think something terrible has happened, you don't know what to do with your grief.
A quiet Ohio street. Early morning. The kind of neighborhood where nothing dramatic ever seems to happen. Lawns trimmed. Mailboxes upright. Dogs barking behind white fences. And yet, On a grey morning in October 2004, police cruisers rolled in fast, lights flashing red and blue across the windows of sleeping houses. By noon, the entire county would be whispering the same words. Cold case. Homicide. Unanswered questions. It began with a call that seemed ordinary. A neighbor dialing 911 just after sunrise. Something wasn't right next door. The front door had been open all night. Lights still on. A car sitting crooked in the driveway. The caller's voice trembled as they spoke, like someone who already knew the answer before police even arrived. When officers stepped inside the small brick house, the silence hit them first. No television. No music. Just the dull hum of a refrigerator somewhere in the kitchen. Then they saw her. 32-year-old Melissa Carter lay on the living room floor, partially hidden by the shadow of a tipped-over coffee table. A single lamp had shattered beside her. Glass scattered across the carpet like frozen rain. The scene looked chaotic, but strangely contained. Not the kind of destruction detectives usually saw during a violent struggle. There were no broken windows. No forced entry. No obvious weapon. Just a body, a quiet room, and a question that would echo through Ohio for decades. What happened here? Melissa Carter was the kind of person people described with the same words again and again. Friendly. Responsible. Quiet. She worked as a dental assistant at a clinic 15 minutes away in downtown Columbus. Co-workers remembered her laugh. Patients remembered her patience. Her boss described her as dependable to a fault. The kind of employee who arrived early and stayed late without complaint. But that morning, Melissa hadn't shown up. At first, the clinic staff assumed she was sick. Maybe overslept. Maybe car trouble. But when phone calls went unanswered and her car was spotted sitting untouched in her driveway, worry turned into something darker. Then came the police tape. Then came the news vans. Within hours, local television stations were broadcasting the story. Ohio woman found dead in apparent homicide. Investigation underway. Neighbors gathered in small clusters along the sidewalk, whispering in low voices. They talked about the strange light in Melissa's living room the night before. They talked about a car that might have driven past slowly around midnight. They talked about the silence. But none of them could say exactly what they saw. Inside the house, detectives moved slowly, carefully documenting every inch of the scene. Photographs. Measurements. Fingerprints. A forensic team dusting surfaces under bright white lights. The medical examiner would later confirm what investigators already suspected. Melissa Carter had been strangled. No gunshot. No stabbing. Just pressure. Force. Someone close enough to hear her breathing, close enough to feel her struggle. A deeply personal kind of violence. And that fact immediately raised another question. If there was no forced entry, then Melissa likely knew the person who walked through that door. Detectives began reconstructing the last hours of her life. The timeline started the evening before. October 14, 2004. Melissa left work just after 5:30 p.m. Co-workers remembered her mentioning plans to stay home. Nothing special. Just dinner, maybe a movie. A quiet night. Security cameras at a grocery store captured her at 6:02 p.m., buying pasta, salad mix, and a small bottle of red wine. Nothing unusual. The cashier later told police Melissa seemed relaxed, even cheerful. At 6:27 p.m., she returned home. Phone records showed a short call to her younger sister at 7:11 p.m. They talked about weekend plans. A birthday dinner coming up. Nothing tense. Nothing urgent. At 8:03 p.m., Melissa sent a text message to a friend. Long week. Finally relaxing. Those would be the last confirmed words she ever sent. After that silence. No outgoing calls. No internet activity. No lights turned off. And sometime between 9 p.m. and midnight someone entered that house. Investigators began knocking on doors across the neighborhood. Did anyone hear shouting? Did anyone see a stranger? Did anyone notice a car leaving the area late at night? One neighbor thought they heard a thud around 10:30 p.m., but assumed it was furniture being moved. Another neighbor claimed they saw headlights pause briefly outside Melissa's driveway around 11 p.m. But memory is fragile. Especially after tragedy. Stories shifted. Times blurred. Details faded. Inside Melissa's house, forensic technicians made a discovery that at first seemed promising. A partial fingerprint on the kitchen counter. It didn't match Melissa. And it didn't match anyone already inside the police database. But that was only the first strange detail. There were signs someone had opened the refrigerator. A bottle of water missing. A wine glass in the sink that Melissa's family insisted wasn't hers. 2 glasses had been used that night. Meaning Melissa might not have been alone. Yet investigators could find no clear DNA from another person. No blood. No hair. No fibers that didn't belong. It was as if someone had walked into the house, committed a murder, and then simply vanished. Detectives started with the most obvious possibilities. Boyfriend. Ex-boyfriend. Family conflicts. Workplace tensions. But Melissa didn't have a boyfriend at the time. Her previous relationship had ended months earlier, reportedly on calm terms. Friends described her as cautious about dating. Her family insisted she had no enemies. Police interviewed more than 40 people during the first 2 weeks of the investigation. Co-workers. Neighbors. Old classmates. A delivery driver who had passed through the neighborhood. Every interview ended the same way. No motive. No suspect. No clear direction. The media coverage intensified. Local newspapers began printing headlines that sounded more like warnings than reports. Who killed Melissa Carter? Quiet Ohio town shaken by brutal mystery. Police search for answers in suburban homicide. Tips flooded into the department. Someone thought they saw a suspicious man walking down the street weeks earlier. Another caller insisted a white van had been parked near Melissa's house on multiple nights. Each lead sent detectives chasing shadows. None led anywhere real. Weeks passed. Then months. Winter arrived. And slowly, the urgency began to fade from the headlines. But inside the Carter family home, nothing faded. Melissa's parents kept her bedroom exactly the same. Her sister refused to celebrate holidays without leaving an empty chair at the table. And every time the phone rang late at night, hope flickered again. Maybe police had found something. Maybe the case had broken open. But the call never came. By the summer of 2005, investigators quietly began using a phrase they hated. Active, but stalled. The file grew thicker. Witness statements. Forensic reports. Crime scene photos. Yet the central question remained untouched. Who was inside that house the night Melissa Carter died? Then, nearly a year later, a small detail resurfaced. A witness who had never spoken before. A man who lived 3 houses down. He claimed that sometime around midnight on the night of the murder, he saw someone walking quickly away from Melissa's property. Not running, but moving fast. Head down. Hands in pockets. The streetlight cast only a faint glow, but the witness believed the person was a man. Average height. Dark jacket. Walking toward the intersection, before disappearing into the night. Detectives pressed him for more details. A face. A car. Anything. But the man shook his head. I just remember thinking that guy shouldn't be here this late. It was the kind of statement investigators hear all the time after tragedies. Suspicious in hindsight, but useless in court. Still, the lead sparked new energy inside the department. Could this mystery figure be the killer? Or just another late-night passerby who unknowingly walked through a crime scene timeline? Police searched nearby businesses for security footage. But most cameras had already overwritten recordings from that night. Technology in 2004 simply wasn't what it would become later. Another door closed. Another lead faded. And slowly, almost quietly, the investigation began drifting toward a place detectives never want a case to go. The cold shelf. Where unsolved files sit year after year. Waiting. Gathering dust. But in the shadows of that file cabinet something else was waiting too. A detail so small it had almost been ignored. A fragment buried deep in the evidence logs. Something investigators wouldn't truly understand until many years later. Because the story of Melissa Carter's death was far from over. In fact, the most disturbing chapter had not even begun. Cold air settled over Ohio that winter, the kind that made the streets quiet long before midnight. Snow clung to the edges of sidewalks. Porch lights glowed through frosted windows. Life in the small Columbus suburbs slowly returned to routine, at least on the surface. People went back to work. Children walked to school. Holiday decorations appeared on front lawns. But beneath the calm, something heavy lingered. Melissa Carter's house remained dark. Police tape had long been removed, but the silence around that brick home seemed permanent. Neighbors avoided looking at it when they drove past. Some swore they still saw lights flicker inside late at night, even though the electricity had been shut off weeks earlier. Rumors travel fast in small communities. And by early 2005, the theories had already begun multiplying. A jealous lover. A burglary gone wrong. A stranger passing through town. Some whispered about a serial killer. Others insisted the answer had to be someone Melissa trusted. Someone who had sat in that living room, maybe even shared the wine found in the sink. Detectives inside the Franklin County Sheriff's Office were wrestling with the same questions. The case file had already expanded into multiple binders, each one packed with photographs, interviews, and lab reports that seemed to circle the truth without ever touching it. One detail continued to trouble investigators. The second wine glass. It sat inside an evidence bag in the property room, carefully labeled and catalogued. At first glance it looked ordinary, clear glass, thin stem, a faint ring of dried residue along the rim. But it represented a possibility that changed the entire narrative of the night. Melissa may not have been alone. Forensic technicians had dusted the glass repeatedly. They found a partial fingerprint, faint and incomplete. Too smudged to run through national databases with any certainty. They also attempted DNA extraction from the rim. But the results came back frustratingly inconclusive. Either the sample had degraded, or whoever used that glass left almost nothing behind. It was a ghost trace. A hint that someone had been there, but not enough to identify them. Detective Alan Mercer studied that evidence bag more than anyone else on the team. A veteran investigator with 22 years on the force, Mercer had seen violent crimes before. Murders fueled by rage, greed, revenge. Most of them followed patterns. Emotional explosions. Careless mistakes. But Melissa's case felt different. Controlled. Quiet. Almost deliberate. Whoever killed her hadn't ransacked the house. They hadn't stolen valuables. Melissa's wallet sat untouched on the kitchen counter. Jewelry still rested in a small dish near the bedroom mirror. Nothing suggested robbery, which left motive floating somewhere in the dark. Mercer returned again and again to the timeline. 6:27 p.m., Melissa arrives home. 7:11 p.m., phone call with her sister. 8:03 p.m., last text message. After that, the night becomes a blank page. But something must have happened between 8 o'clock and midnight. Someone must have knocked on that door, or already been inside. Investigators re-examined Melissa's phone records. At first glance they looked ordinary. Calls to family, a few co-workers, occasional messages with friends. But buried within those logs was a number that appeared twice during the week before her death. Both calls lasted less than 30 seconds. Both occurred late at night. And the number wasn't saved in Melissa's contacts. When detectives traced it, they discovered it belonged to a prepaid mobile phone, the kind that could be purchased with cash and discarded without a paper trail. A burner phone. That discovery sent a ripple through the investigation. Who had called Melissa from an untraceable phone just days before she died? And why were the calls so brief? Mercer ordered a deeper analysis. Phone tower records were pulled, mapping the approximate location of the device during those calls. The result was frustratingly vague. The phone had pinged off a tower roughly 2 miles from Melissa's home. That radius covered thousands of residents. Still, detectives treated it as their first real thread. They canvassed the area again. Re-interviewed witnesses. Asked neighbors if anyone had noticed unfamiliar vehicles or strangers lingering nearby. Most people had nothing new to say. But one neighbor remembered something strange. A dark sedan parked near the end of the street on 2 different evenings earlier that week. The car hadn't belonged to anyone in the neighborhood. The driver never exited the vehicle. He simply sat there for long stretches before eventually leaving. When detectives asked for a description, the neighbor hesitated. It was dark, maybe blue or black. Older model. That's all I can really say. License plate? No. Driver's face? Couldn't see it. Another shadow in the case. Another fragment without shape. Still, Mercer felt something about that car mattered. Someone watching the street. Waiting. Observing Melissa's routine. If the sedan belonged to the person using that burner phone, it meant the murder might not have been spontaneous. It might have been planned. Weeks later, another piece of evidence emerged from an unexpected place. Melissa's workplace. A co-worker named Sandra Blake approached investigators after remembering something that hadn't seemed important at the time. 3 days before Melissa died, Sandra had overheard a strange phone conversation in the break room. Melissa had stepped outside to answer a call. Her voice sounded tense. Short responses. Long pauses. Sandra remembered Melissa saying one specific phrase before ending the call. "Please stop calling me." Detectives leaned forward when they heard that detail. Had Melissa been dealing with harassment? A secret relationship? Someone she was trying to avoid? Sandra admitted she didn't ask questions. Melissa seemed private about her personal life. But that one sentence stayed in Sandra's mind. Please stop calling me. Suddenly the burner phone looked less like coincidence and more like pressure. Someone had been reaching out to Melissa repeatedly. Someone she didn't want to talk to. Investigators obtained security footage from the clinic parking lot for the days leading up to the murder. Grainy cameras recorded cars entering and leaving, employees walking toward the building. Most vehicles were familiar. But on October 12, 2 days before Melissa's death, a dark sedan appeared again. It pulled into the lot, briefly idled near the entrance, then drove away without anyone getting out. The footage was poor quality. No license plate visible. But the shape of the vehicle looked similar to the car the neighbor had described. Detective Mercer watched the clip over and over. The car lingered for 30 seconds. Then vanished. Whoever was inside might have been watching Melissa. Or waiting for her. Or deciding something. The possibility tightened the atmosphere inside the investigation room. If someone had been following Melissa for days, maybe weeks, then the murder wasn't random. It was personal. And somewhere in that growing pile of evidence was the identity of the person who had been calling, watching, waiting. But as winter melted into spring, the investigation began to hit the same wall again and again. No confirmed owner for the sedan. No subscriber identity for the burner phone. No fingerprints matching the partial print on the wine glass. Every promising thread dissolved under closer scrutiny. By late 2005, the case had already consumed thousands of man-hours. And yet the central mystery remained untouched. Who had walked into Melissa Carter's home that night? Detective Mercer refused to let the file fade quietly into storage. He had worked too many cases where time slowly erased the urgency of justice. But even the most determined investigators eventually face reality. Witness memories fade. Evidence degrades. And killers who vanish without a trace often stay vanished. Still, Mercer couldn't shake a strange feeling about the case. A quiet instinct that the answer wasn't far away. Not a stranger passing through town. Not a phantom in the dark. But someone already connected to Melissa's life. Someone whose name might already be sitting somewhere inside that thick case file. Because sometimes the most terrifying truth in a homicide investigation isn't how mysterious the killer is. It's how ordinary they might appear. And somewhere beyond the pages of interviews and evidence logs, a person who knew exactly what happened that night was still walking free. Still breathing the same Ohio air. Still watching the years pass as the murder slowly became a memory for everyone else. Except the Carter family. And except the one person who knew exactly how Melissa Carter's life had ended. In the months after Melissa Carter's death, the story refused to disappear completely. The news cameras left. The headlines shrank. But in quiet corners of Columbus, the question lingered like a shadow stretching across the years. Who killed Melissa Carter? For Detective Alan Mercer, the case had already begun to take on a different weight. Some investigations fade from memory once they stall. Others cling to a detective's mind long after the paperwork is filed away. Melissa's case belonged to the second category. Because the more Mercer studied the timeline, the more something about it felt incomplete. People rarely vanish into a night without leaving a ripple somewhere. A sound. A sighting. A mistake. Violence almost always leaves chaos behind. Yet the scene inside Melissa's living room felt strangely restrained. One overturned table. One shattered lamp. A body. And almost nothing else. That level of control suggested something unsettling. Whoever killed Melissa hadn't panicked. They hadn't lashed out wildly. They had applied pressure, held it, and watched the life drain away in silence. It meant the killer had time. Time to stay. Time to move around the house. Time to clean or remove anything that might identify them. Which brought Mercer back to the one detail that continued to bother him, the missing minutes after Melissa's final text message. The hours between 8:03 p.m. and midnight was still a void. And somewhere inside that void, the truth was hiding. Investigators began revisiting people who had already been interviewed during the first chaotic weeks of the case. Sometimes witnesses remember new details once the initial shock fades. Sometimes guilt pushes people to talk. One of the first people Mercer called back was Melissa's former boyfriend, Daniel Reeves. Reeves had dated Melissa for about 8 months the previous year. Their relationship ended in early 2004, several months before her death. At the time, both had described the breakup as mutual. But Mercer had learned something important during his career. Breakups rarely look the same from both sides. Daniel Reeves lived 20 minutes away in a small apartment complex. When detectives arrived, he looked surprised, but not frightened. He answered questions calmly. Yes, he and Melissa had dated. Yes, they had broken up. No, there had been no arguments leading up to the separation. Reeves insisted they simply realized the relationship wasn't working. Did you speak to Melissa recently? Mercer asked. Daniel hesitated. Maybe once a couple months ago. Just checking in. Phone records partially supported that statement. There had been a short call in July, nothing after that. Where were you on the night of October 14th? Mercer continued. Reeves leaned back, thinking. I was working late. I manage a warehouse shift. We closed around midnight. Detectives verified the claim. Security logs showed Reeves' keycard entering the warehouse at 6:48 p.m. and exiting at 12:17 a.m. Several employees remembered seeing him during the shift. His alibi held. Still, Mercer couldn't shake the feeling that Daniel Reeves knew more about Melissa's life than he was revealing. Not necessarily about the murder, but about the people who might have been orbiting her world. So Mercer asked a final question. Did Melissa ever mention someone bothering her? Calling repeatedly. Maybe someone she didn't want to hear from. Daniel's eyes narrowed slightly. Not exactly, but she did say something weird once. Mercer leaned forward. What kind of weird? Reeves shrugged. A few weeks before we broke up, she mentioned someone had started sending her messages. Not threats, just strange stuff. What kind of messages? She said they were vague. Like someone who knew things about her routine. What time she left work. Where she bought groceries. Stuff like that. Mercer felt a chill run through his thoughts. Did she say who it was? No. She said the number changed a lot. Different phones. Burner phones. The same pattern investigators had already seen. Mercer asked the obvious question. Did Melissa seem scared? Daniel paused before answering. Not scared exactly, more annoyed. Like someone who wouldn't leave her alone. The interview ended soon after. But the implications were troubling. If Melissa had been receiving messages from unknown numbers even before her relationship ended, the harassment might have been happening for months. Someone had been watching her. Tracking her. Learning her routine. And perhaps waiting for the right moment. Back at the sheriff's office, investigators began digging deeper into Melissa's digital history. Computers in 2004 weren't as traceable as modern devices, but there were still fragments that could reveal patterns. Emails. Early instant messaging logs. Internet browsing history. Most of it looked ordinary. Recipe searches. Online shopping. Messages with friends. But buried within her inbox were several emails from an account with no identifiable name. The address looked like a random string of numbers and letters. And the messages themselves were unsettling. Short. Cryptic. You looked nice today. Blue looks good on you. I saw you at the store. None of the emails contained threats. But each one carried the same eerie implication. Someone was watching. The timestamps stretched back nearly 5 months before her death. Melissa had never responded to any of them. Instead, she created a folder titled Spam and moved them there. But the sender continued. Message after message. Observation after observation. Mercer felt the investigation shift slightly beneath his feet. The murder might not have started on the night Melissa died. It might have started months earlier with quiet surveillance. Someone obsessed enough to watch her daily life. Someone patient enough to wait. Detectives attempted to trace the origin of the email account. But the digital trail ended quickly. The messages had been sent through public internet terminals, libraries, cafes, places where dozens of people could access a computer without identification. The sender had been careful. Almost methodical. Which raised another disturbing possibility. This wasn't random fixation. It was deliberate stalking. And if the stalker had escalated from watching to killing, the timeline of the case suddenly looked very different. Mercer reviewed witness statements again. The dark sedan near Melissa's street. The car idling in the clinic parking lot. The burner phone calls. The mysterious emails. Individually, each detail seemed small. But together they formed a pattern. Someone had been orbiting Melissa's life like a satellite, always nearby, never visible. And eventually, that invisible presence had stepped inside her house. One night. One moment. One fatal encounter. Yet the most frustrating truth remained unchanged. No one could identify the person behind the surveillance. The emails contained no usable metadata. The burner phones had been discarded. The sedan had never been traced. And the partial fingerprint on the wine glass still matched no one in the system. The investigation was chasing a ghost. Months turned into another year. Then another. The case slowly drifted from active investigation to a phrase detectives dread hearing. Unresolved. By 2007, Melissa Carter's murder had officially joined the growing list of cold cases in Ohio. But the story refused to fully disappear. Because every so often a new piece of information would surface. A tip. A sighting. A strange coincidence. Most of them collapsed under scrutiny. But each one forced investigators to reopen the file again. To re-examine the same evidence. To ask the same question that had haunted the case from the beginning. Who had been watching Melissa Carter? And more importantly, why? Because somewhere in Ohio, a person had spent months studying her life, studying her movements, learning exactly when she would be alone. And if that person had succeeded in staying invisible once, there was no guarantee they wouldn't try again. By 2007, the Melissa Carter file had grown heavy enough to bend the metal rails of the cold case cabinet where it rested. The label along its spine was simple, almost clinical: Carter, Melissa, homicide, the 14th of October 2004. But inside those folders lived something far less tidy. Hundreds of photographs, interview transcripts, evidence inventories, leads that once felt promising, but had slowly collapsed into dead ends. Cold case. 2 words detectives hate seeing attached to a name. Because a cold case doesn't mean forgotten. It means waiting. Waiting for technology, for memory, for a mistake. Waiting for something, anything, to disturb the silence that follows an unsolved murder. In the Carter investigation, the silence had been growing louder every year. The emails from the unknown sender had stopped entirely after Melissa's death. The burner phone number had never been used again. The dark sedan described by neighbors had vanished from the area without leaving so much as a license plate behind. It was as if the person responsible had simply stepped back into the darkness and stayed there. But Detective Alan Mercer refused to let the case disappear into the quiet storage rooms of the sheriff's office. Even after the investigation formally cooled, he kept returning to the evidence. Late nights, empty hallways, the dull hum of fluorescent lights above his desk. Mercer would spread the photographs across the table again and again, searching for something everyone else had overlooked. Sometimes the smallest mistake breaks a case wide open. A forgotten fingerprint. A security camera nobody checked. A witness who remembers one extra detail. But every time Mercer studied the Carter evidence, he kept circling the same unsettling truth. The killer had been careful. Too careful. There were no defensive wounds on Melissa's hands, suggesting she either trusted the person who approached her or didn't see the attack coming until it was too late. There was no sign of forced entry, which meant one of 2 things. Either Melissa had willingly opened the door to her killer, or the killer had already been inside the house. Both possibilities pointed toward someone familiar. Someone she didn't perceive as a threat. Yet investigators had interviewed every known friend, co-worker, relative, and acquaintance in her life. No one fit the picture. Still, Mercer believed the stalker theory deserved more attention. The anonymous emails. The burner phone calls. The sightings of the dark sedan. They suggested someone had been observing Melissa from a distance for months. A person building quiet knowledge of her life. Learning her habits. Her schedule. The exact time she returned home each evening. Mercer began assembling a detailed map of Melissa's weekly routine. Monday through Friday, she left work between 5:15 and 5:45 p.m. She stopped at the same grocery store 2 or 3 times a week. She attended a yoga class every Wednesday evening. She visited her parents every other Sunday. Patterns. Predictable movements through familiar places. To an ordinary person, those habits meant comfort. To a stalker, they meant opportunity. Mercer expanded the map outward. Who else regularly appeared in those locations? Store employees. Gym members. Customers at nearby cafes. The list quickly grew into hundreds of names. But one location stood out above the others. The grocery store where Melissa had been seen the evening she died. Security footage from October 14th still existed in the evidence archive. Grainy black and white video captured the aisles and checkout counters of the store that night. Mercer replayed the footage repeatedly. There was Melissa, pushing a small shopping cart down the pasta aisle at 5:58 p.m. There she was at the register a few minutes later, smiling briefly at the cashier. Then she left the building. But something else appeared in the background of the footage. A man standing near the front entrance. He wasn't shopping. He wasn't talking to anyone. He simply stood there, partially turned away from the camera, as if waiting. When Melissa exited the store, the man moved. Not quickly. Not obviously. Just a slow shift of posture, before following several seconds later. Mercer froze the frame. The image quality was poor. The man's face remained mostly hidden beneath the brim of a baseball cap. But the timing raised questions. Had he been watching Melissa inside the store? Had he followed her outside? The video continued. Cameras outside the entrance captured Melissa walking toward her car. 10 seconds later, the same man exited the building and walked in the same direction. But then the footage ended. The parking lot camera had malfunctioned that evening. The man disappeared from the record. Mercer felt a pulse of energy ripple through the investigation. For the first time in years, they might have a physical image of someone connected to Melissa's final hours. Detectives enhanced the footage using every tool available at the time. The results were frustrating. The man's features remained indistinct. Height estimation placed him around 5'10". Medium build. Dark jacket. Baseball cap. It was a description vague enough to match half the population of Ohio. Still, investigators released the image to the public. Local news stations aired the clip repeatedly, asking viewers if they recognized the man near the store entrance. Tips began pouring in. Dozens of callers claimed the figure looked like someone they knew. An ex-husband. A neighbor. A co-worker. Each lead sent detectives chasing new directions. Each lead collapsed within days. The mysterious man in the footage remained unidentified. But Mercer couldn't shake a disturbing thought. If the man in the grocery store video had followed Melissa to her car, then he might have followed her all the way home. And if that was true, the killer may have been watching her long before she reached the house. Waiting for the perfect moment. The theory gained another layer when investigators discovered something else inside Melissa's car. A parking receipt tucked into the center console. The timestamp showed Melissa had briefly stopped at a small pharmacy 2 blocks from the grocery store. The receipt read 6:18 p.m. Security footage from that pharmacy was retrieved as well. This time, the cameras captured Melissa entering the store alone. But minutes later, the same man from the grocery footage appeared again. Baseball cap. Dark jacket. Walking slowly through the entrance. Mercer stared at the screen. 2 sightings. 2 locations. Within the same hour. The pattern was becoming harder to ignore. The man had likely been following her across multiple stops. Watching. Waiting. And perhaps building the courage to approach her. Yet something else about the footage bothered Mercer. At the pharmacy counter, Melissa appeared relaxed. She paid for a small item, cough drops, and left without looking over her shoulder. If the man had been stalking her for months, Melissa didn't seem aware of it. Which meant the surveillance had been subtle. Careful. Professional, almost. Or perhaps the man had only started following her that evening. But that raised an even darker possibility. What if the killer hadn't planned the murder for months? What if something happened that night, something spontaneous that turned obsession into violence? The footage offered no answers. Only more questions. Still, Mercer believed the man in the baseball cap might be the closest thing the investigation had to a suspect. Someone who had physically moved through Melissa's world just hours before she died. Someone who had followed her from store to store. Possibly all the way back to her quiet brick house. But identifying him would prove far more difficult than anyone expected. Because as investigators soon discovered the man in the baseball cap had vanished almost as completely as the killer himself. And somewhere beyond those blurred security frames, a person who knew exactly what happened inside Melissa Carter's living room that night was still walking free. Still blending into crowds. Still living an ordinary life. While the mystery he left behind continued to grow darker with every passing year. The image of the man in the baseball cap quickly became the most haunting artifact in the entire Melissa Carter investigation. A blurred silhouette frozen on an old security camera. No name. No clear face. Just a figure lingering at the edges of Melissa's final evening. But sometimes, even a shadow is enough to restart a cold case. Detective Alan Mercer knew that if the man in that footage truly followed Melissa from the grocery store to the pharmacy, then the man likely saw her get into her car. Which meant he may have followed her all the way home. That possibility shifted the entire timeline of the crime. Until that moment, investigators believed Melissa's killer had arrived sometime after she returned home at 6:27 p.m. But if someone had been tracking her movements through the evening, the encounter might have started much earlier. Mercer decided to widen the search. If the man had followed Melissa's car, then he might have been driving. Which meant somewhere between the grocery store and her neighborhood, another camera might have captured his vehicle. The problem was simple. In 2004, security cameras were rare. Most businesses used low-resolution systems that recorded over themselves every few days. Years had already passed. But Mercer still tried. Gas stations. Traffic intersections. Convenience stores. Parking lots. Investigators contacted every business along the route Melissa likely drove home that evening. They asked owners if any archived footage might still exist from October 14, 2004. The answer was almost always the same. No. The recordings were long gone. Yet one small gas station on the edge of the route produced a surprising response. The owner had recently replaced their security system and stored several old backup tapes in a cardboard box inside a storage room. The tapes were dusty, unlabeled, and disorganized. But they were from 2004. Mercer felt the pulse of possibility again. Technicians spent days reviewing the footage, fast-forwarding through hours of grainy video. Cars came and went. Customers bought cigarettes and fuel. Nothing seemed unusual. Then, around 6:35 p.m., a familiar shape appeared. Melissa's car. The timestamp aligned perfectly with her route home. She pulled briefly into the gas station parking lot, then exited again seconds later, likely using the lot to turn around toward her neighborhood. 10 seconds later, another vehicle entered the frame. A dark sedan. Older model. The driver slowed near the entrance, almost as if hesitating, before continuing in the same direction Melissa had just taken. Mercer froze the frame. It wasn't clear enough to read a license plate. But the timing, the color, the type of vehicle. Everything matched the witness descriptions from Melissa's street. The dark sedan had likely followed her. Which meant whoever sat behind that wheel knew exactly where Melissa lived. Detectives studied the vehicle carefully. Four-door sedan. Late 1990s model. Possibly a Chevrolet or Ford. Nothing distinctive. Nothing unique. A car that could blend easily into traffic. Still, the image confirmed something critical. Melissa had been followed. Someone had trailed her through the city that evening, watching her routine stops, waiting until she returned home. The next question was far more chilling. Why? Was the killer planning to confront her? Or simply observing until something changed? Mercer returned once again to the crime scene reports. There had been no signs of forced entry, meaning Melissa either opened the door voluntarily, or the killer slipped inside while she was distracted. But what if the encounter didn't begin at the door? What if the killer approached her outside? In the driveway? Or while she was unlocking the house? The scenario began forming in Mercer's mind. Melissa parks the car. She steps out carrying groceries. A stranger approaches. Maybe asks for help. Maybe pretends to be lost. Maybe even introduces himself politely. And in that brief moment of hesitation, the stranger steps closer. Too close. From there, it would have been easy to force his way inside. Once inside the house, the situation could have escalated quickly. But another piece of evidence complicated that theory. There were 2 wine glasses used that night, which meant Melissa had likely spent time with someone voluntarily. Someone she allowed to stay long enough to share a drink. Someone she did not perceive as a threat, at least at first. Mercer studied the scene photographs again. The kitchen counter. The open wine bottle. 2 glasses in the sink. A quiet moment before the violence. The idea unsettled him deeply, because it suggested the killer may not have forced their way inside at all. Melissa might have invited him in. But why would she do that? She lived alone. Friends described her as cautious. She wasn't the kind of person who welcomed strangers late at night. Unless the person wasn't a stranger. Unless the person had convinced her he wasn't dangerous. Which led investigators back to the emails. You looked nice today. I saw you at the store. I saw you leaving work. The tone of those messages wasn't openly threatening. They sounded almost familiar. As if the sender believed he already had some kind of connection to her. An invisible relationship built entirely in his own mind. Obsession can twist perception that way. To a stalker, observation becomes intimacy. Watching someone's life from a distance starts to feel like knowing them. Mercer had seen it before in other cases. People who convince themselves that they belong in someone else's life even when that person has never noticed them. If Melissa's killer had been watching her for months, he might have believed he had the right to approach her. To talk. To explain himself. To force a conversation she never wanted. And if that conversation went badly, the situation could have spiraled out of control. Still, there remained a gap in the theory. Why the wine? Why the calm atmosphere before the violence? The crime scene suggested at least some period of normal interaction, which meant Melissa might have spoken with her killer for several minutes, maybe longer, before realizing something was wrong. What did they talk about? Did he reveal himself as the sender of the messages? Did she recognize him from somewhere? Did fear begin slowly or explode in an instant? Those answers died with Melissa. Meanwhile, investigators continued chasing the only tangible lead they had. The dark sedan. Vehicle registration records from nearby counties were searched for cars matching the description. Thousands of possibilities emerged. Too many. Detectives narrowed the list by geographic proximity to Melissa's home and workplace. Still hundreds remained. Without a license plate, without a driver description, the search became almost impossible. Weeks passed. Then months. And once again the investigation slowed. Mercer kept the still image of the sedan pinned above his desk. A reminder. A silent witness captured on a grainy gas station camera. Somewhere inside that car had been a person who followed Melissa Carter through the final hour of her life. A person who watched her drive home. A person who likely walked through her front door. And if Mercer's instincts were right, that same person had calmly driven away into the Ohio night, after leaving a body behind. Vanishing into traffic. Vanishing into anonymity. Leaving behind nothing but fragments of video and a mystery that refused to die. Because somewhere out there, the driver of that dark sedan still knew exactly what happened inside Melissa Carter's house. And every year that passed without an answer only made that silence louder. By the time the investigation reached its 4th year, the Melissa Carter case had developed a strange reputation inside the Franklin County Sheriff's Office. Younger detectives referred to it quietly as the ghost file. Not because the victim had been forgotten, but because every lead seemed to dissolve just as investigators got close enough to touch it. The man in the baseball cap. The dark sedan. The anonymous emails. The burner phone. Each one hinted at a presence circling Melissa's life, yet none of them revealed a face. Detective Alan Mercer refused to let the frustration win. Cases like this sometimes required a different kind of patience. The kind that waited for time itself to make a mistake. Because killers who believe they've escaped often grow careless. They talk. They revisit old habits. Or they slip back into the patterns that exposed them in the first place. Mercer began examining another angle of the case that investigators had only briefly explored during the early months, Melissa's daily commute. Every morning she drove the same route to the medical billing office where she worked. The drive took about 20 minutes, passing through several quiet intersections and a small commercial district before reaching the clinic. Routine. Predictable. Exactly the kind of schedule a stalker could memorize easily. Mercer obtained traffic camera logs from the city archives, an enormous collection of outdated digital records. Most were low resolution, and rarely reviewed unless accidents occurred. But if someone had been following Melissa regularly, there was a small chance their vehicle might appear near hers more than once. The process took weeks. Technicians scanned through countless hours of archived footage, marking every instance where Melissa's car appeared in frame. Day after day. Morning after morning. Eventually a pattern began to emerge. On several occasions during the summer of 2004, a dark sedan appeared 2 or 3 vehicles behind Melissa's car at the same intersection near the clinic. The time-stamped images were separated by weeks. June. July. August. The same shape. The same color. Possibly the same vehicle. It wasn't enough to prove anything. In a city the size of Columbus, similar cars passed through those intersections constantly. But the repetition was unsettling. It suggested the possibility that Melissa had been followed far longer than anyone realized. Mercer leaned back in his chair, staring at the freeze frames. If the same car had been trailing her for months, then the stalker had likely memorized every piece of Melissa's routine. Her commute. Her grocery stops. Her evening schedule. Even the nights she stayed home alone. Which meant the killer may have chosen the night of October 14th very carefully. Not randomly. Not impulsively. But as the moment when Melissa would be most vulnerable. The thought deepened the unease surrounding the case. Because long-term stalking cases rarely end well. Obsession tends to escalate. What begins as watching eventually demands contact. And when that contact fails, violence often follows. Still, Mercer faced the same obstacle that had haunted the investigation from the start. The car remained unidentified. Without a clear plate number, detectives were still chasing an invisible driver. But then, almost 5 years after the murder, a small development quietly reopened the conversation. In 2009, a retired school teacher, named Harold Jennings contacted the sheriff's office after seeing a documentary segment about unsolved crimes in Ohio. The program briefly mentioned Melissa Carter's case and showed the still image of the man in the baseball cap from the grocery store footage. Jennings called the tip line with uncertainty in his voice. "I might have seen that guy once," he told the operator. Detectives invited him in for an interview. Jennings explained that in the fall of 2004, he had worked part-time at a small bookstore cafe not far from Melissa's workplace. The job mostly involved stocking shelves and cleaning tables. One afternoon, he couldn't remember the exact date. A man came in and sat alone at a table near the window for nearly 2 hours. That wasn't unusual. But what caught Jennings' attention was what the man was doing. He wasn't reading. He wasn't using the cafe's magazines. He was simply staring out the window toward the parking lot across the street. The lot belonged to the clinic where Melissa worked. Jennings remembered thinking the man looked tense, restless, constantly checking his watch. At one point the man pulled a small notebook from his pocket and wrote something down. Then, after a few more minutes of staring outside, he stood up and left. Jennings didn't think much of it at the time. But when he later saw the news coverage about Melissa Carter's murder, and the image of the man in the baseball cap, something about the memory returned. He couldn't say with certainty that it was the same man. But the posture, the build, the baseball cap. It looked similar. Detective Mercer listened carefully as Jennings described the man. Late 30s maybe, Jennings said slowly. White male. Medium build. Dark hair under the cap. Didn't speak to anyone. Did he order anything? Coffee. Black. Did he say a name when he paid? Jennings shook his head. No. Cash. Cash again. Another small decision that erased identity. Mercer asked the final question. Did you notice how he arrived? Car. Was? Jennings nodded slightly. I remember he parked across the street. In that big lot near the pharmacy. Mercer's pulse quickened. The same pharmacy Melissa had visited the evening she died. Do you remember the car? Mercer asked. Jennings frowned as he tried to recall. It was older, dark color. Maybe blue. I didn't pay much attention to the model. A dark sedan. The description matched the vehicle that had haunted the case for years. If Jennings' memory was accurate, the stalker had been observing Melissa from the cafe window months before the murder. Watching her workplace. Studying her schedule. Possibly even writing notes about her movements. The realization painted a disturbing picture. This wasn't a brief obsession. It was surveillance. Slow. Patient. Calculating. Someone had spent months studying Melissa Carter's life from a distance, building a silent familiarity she never knew existed. And eventually that silent observer had crossed the invisible boundary between watching and acting. Yet the most frustrating truth remained unchanged. Even with the new witness, investigators still didn't know the man's name. They didn't know where he lived. They didn't know why Melissa became the target of his attention. All they had were fragments, sightings scattered across time. A man standing in a bookstore cafe. A man following her through a grocery store. A man appearing briefly in a pharmacy camera. A dark sedan trailing her car through traffic. Pieces of a story that refused to assemble into a full picture. But Mercer understood something important about obsession. People who stalk rarely stop at one victim. The same patterns often appear again somewhere else. Which meant if the man who killed Melissa Carter truly existed the way Mercer believed, he might have been watching someone else even now. Somewhere in Ohio. Watching quietly from a distance. Waiting for the moment when watching would no longer be enough. The Melissa Carter file had already survived 5 winters by the time Detective Alan Mercer began to notice something strange happening inside the evidence room. It started with the letters. Not the emails from 2004, those had already been archived, but new ones. Physical envelopes arriving at the sheriff's office with no return address. The first appeared in early 2010. A plain white envelope. Standard postage. No fingerprints visible on the surface. Inside was a single sheet of printer paper folded neatly in half. On the page were only 6 words. You're still looking in the wrong place. No signature. No explanation. Just a sentence. At first, investigators assumed it was a prank. High-profile unsolved cases attract attention from people who want to insert themselves into the story. But Mercer wasn't convinced. Because the letter had been mailed to him personally. Not to the department. Not to the general tip line. His name had been typed precisely beneath the address of the sheriff's office. Someone had intended the message for him. Forensic technicians dusted the envelope and paper carefully. No usable fingerprints. The ink came from a standard inkjet printer, impossible to trace. The postmark revealed only one detail. The letter had been mailed from a suburban post office about 30 minutes north of Columbus, which narrowed the possibilities very little. Still, Mercer added the letter to the case file. Most anonymous messages lead nowhere. But occasionally they come from someone closer to the truth than they realize. 2 months later, a second envelope arrived. Same type of paper. Same plain white envelope. Same lack of fingerprints. Inside was another typed sentence. She opened the door herself. Mercer stared at the words for a long time. The detail matched what investigators already suspected, that Melissa likely opened the door voluntarily. But that information had never been confirmed publicly. Which raised a disturbing possibility. Whoever sent the letters might know something about the crime scene. Perhaps even something investigators had never revealed. Mercer ordered the envelopes sent for deeper analysis. Paper fiber examination. Ink composition comparison. Handwriting was impossible to analyze because the messages were typed. The investigation once again collided with silence. But Mercer couldn't ignore the timing. 6 years after the murder, someone had decided to contact him directly. Not the media. Not the victim's family. Him. It felt personal. Then the third letter arrived. This one came nearly a year later. Again the same envelope. Same typewritten font. The message this time was longer. You missed the only thing that mattered. 7 words that echoed through Mercer's thoughts like a warning. Investigators compared the paper stock across all 3 letters. Identical. The same brand sold at dozens of office supply stores across Ohio. Postmarks showed each envelope had been mailed from different suburban locations, which suggested the sender was moving around intentionally, avoiding patterns. Careful. Methodical. The same kind of patience seen in the stalking behavior surrounding Melissa's death. Mercer felt the case shifting again. The letters could mean several things. A hoaxer trying to play games with detectives. A witness withholding information. Or something far more disturbing. The killer himself. Some offenders cannot resist revisiting their crimes. They want to know if investigators are getting close. Sometimes they even enjoy manipulating the search for truth. Mercer pinned copies of the 3 letters on the corkboard above his desk. You're still looking in the wrong place. She opened the door herself. You missed the only thing that mattered. 3 messages. 3 riddles. None of them offering a clear direction. But Mercer began reading them again and again, trying to understand the mindset behind them. The tone wasn't mocking. It wasn't aggressive. It sounded almost disappointed. As if the writer believed detectives had overlooked something obvious. Something simple. Something hiding inside the case from the very beginning. Mercer returned once more to the evidence photographs. Melissa's living room. The broken lamp. The overturned table. The wine glasses. The door. The door. His eyes lingered on that image longer than before. Melissa had opened it willingly. The letter writer emphasized that point. Which meant the killer probably wasn't a complete stranger. Or at least not someone who appeared threatening. The more Mercer studied Melissa's life, the more one possibility began creeping into his mind. What if the killer wasn't someone lurking in the shadows of her routine? What if he had been hiding in plain sight the entire time? Someone Melissa encountered regularly. Someone whose presence didn't trigger alarm. A co-worker. A service worker. A delivery driver. Someone who could knock on her door without raising suspicion. Mercer reopened the interview transcripts from 2004. Page after page of statements from people who crossed Melissa's path. Then he noticed a name he hadn't thought about in years. Thomas Bell. Bell had been a temporary maintenance technician at the medical clinic where Melissa worked. His job involved minor repairs, light fixtures, plumbing issues, routine maintenance tasks. According to records, Bell had worked at the clinic for about 6 months during early 2004. Then he left suddenly in September. 1 month before Melissa died. At the time, detectives interviewed Bell briefly. He denied knowing Melissa personally beyond occasional greetings in the hallway. He also provided an alibi for the night of October 14th. He claimed to have been visiting relatives in Kentucky. The alibi had been partially confirmed by a cousin. But something about the timeline now bothered Mercer. Bell had worked in the same building. He would have seen Melissa frequently. He might have learned her schedule naturally without needing to stalk her from outside locations. Even more troubling, maintenance staff often have access to employee areas. Parking lots. Break rooms. Offices. They observe routines without anyone paying attention. Mercer checked Bell's old employment records. Age at the time, 38. Medium build. Height, 5'10". The same approximate height investigators estimated for the man in the grocery store footage. Bell also owned a car. An older dark blue sedan registered in his name in 2004. Mercer felt a cold current pass through him. The description matched the vehicle captured on the gas station camera. And if Harold Jennings' memory from the cafe was accurate, the man watching the clinic parking lot could have been Bell. A maintenance worker wouldn't appear suspicious sitting nearby. He would simply look like someone waiting for a repair call. The theory was far from proof. But it was the most concrete direction the case had seen in years. There was just one problem. Thomas Bell had moved away. Shortly after leaving the clinic in 2004, he relocated to another state. Investigators at the time never considered him a strong suspect. Which meant his departure raised no alarms. Now, years later, Mercer realized something chilling. If Bell truly had been watching Melissa studying her planning the encounter, then leaving the city immediately after the murder might not have been coincidence. It might have been the final step of the plan. A quiet disappearance into a different life. Far away from the house where Melissa Carter's story ended. But Mercer also understood something else. If Thomas Bell was the man behind the letters, then the killer wasn't just gone. He was still thinking about the case. Still watching. And perhaps still waiting for detectives to realize the one thing they had missed all along. Detective Alan Mercer didn't sleep much the night Thomas Bell's name resurfaced in the Melissa Carter file. For years, the investigation had chased shadows, the dark sedan, the man in the baseball cap, the emails that read like whispers from someone standing just outside Melissa's life. But now, for the first time, one name sat at the center of those shadows. Thomas Bell. A maintenance technician who worked inside the same building as Melissa. A man who fit the physical description. A man who owned a dark sedan. A man who left town almost immediately after the murder. And possibly, if Mercer's instincts were right, the man who had been sending the letters. Still, instincts were not evidence. Mercer knew better than anyone how dangerous it could be to build a case on coincidence. So he began again from the beginning. Bell's employment records from the clinic were retrieved and studied carefully. He had started the job in February 2004 through a third-party maintenance contractor. His responsibilities were simple: repair light fixtures, fix leaking sinks, replace air filters, adjust thermostats. Small tasks that required him to move freely throughout the building, including the administrative offices where Melissa worked. According to the records, Bell had access to a master maintenance key that opened most staff areas. Not private offices, but hallways, supply closets, shared workspaces. Enough access to observe people without drawing attention. Mercer requested old security footage from the clinic archives. Most recordings had been erased years earlier, but a few segments from mid-2004 still existed on backup drives. The video quality was terrible. Grainy, flickering images from hallway cameras that looked like something out of an early surveillance system. But after hours of reviewing footage, Mercer spotted a figure that made him lean closer to the screen. A man pushing a maintenance cart through the hallway outside the billing department. Dark baseball cap. Medium build. Head lowered slightly. The timestamp read July 12, 2004. The man paused near the office doorway. Melissa walked past him carrying a stack of folders. For a brief moment, the two appeared to exchange a few words. Then Melissa continued down the hallway. The maintenance worker remained still watching her walk away. Mercer froze the frame. Even with the poor resolution, something about the posture felt eerily familiar. The same slightly hunched shoulders visible in the grocery store footage. The same dark cap pulled low. If this was Thomas Bell, then he had clearly seen Melissa many times during the months before her death. Possibly spoken to her. Which changed everything. Because if Melissa recognized Bell from work, she might not hesitate to open the door for him. A maintenance worker from the clinic showing up unexpectedly could easily invent a reason. A paperwork issue. A building notice. A forgotten message. Anything simple enough to avoid suspicion. Mercer flipped through the old interview transcript from Bell's 2004 statement. The conversation had been short. Bell claimed he barely knew Melissa. Just another employee in a building full of people. He said he never spoke to her outside of quick greetings. He denied following her anywhere. And his alibi placed him 2 states away the night she died. At the time, detectives accepted the explanation. The cousin in Kentucky had confirmed Bell arrived around 9:30 p.m. that night. But Mercer noticed something troubling about the timeline. Melissa likely died between 7 o'clock and 8 p.m. The drive from Columbus to the cousin's house in Kentucky took about 2 hours. Which meant Bell could theoretically commit the crime, leave the house, and still reach the cousin's place by 9:30. The alibi wasn't impossible. It was simply tight. Mercer reopened the forensic evidence reports, hoping for something, anything, that could connect Bell to the crime scene. But the same frustrating truth remained. No fingerprints. No DNA. Nothing that placed him inside the house. If Bell was the killer, he had been incredibly careful. Or incredibly lucky. Mercer then turned his attention to Bell's life after leaving Ohio. Records showed he moved to Indiana in late October 2004. Less than 2 weeks after Melissa's murder. He took another maintenance job at a warehouse facility. Then 3 years later, he moved again, this time to Missouri. Another job. Another quiet relocation. Each move placed him slightly farther from Columbus. Slightly farther from the crime. The pattern looked almost deliberate. Mercer felt the case tightening around a possibility he couldn't yet prove. But the letters still bothered him. If Bell truly had moved on, why send them? Why reopen the case years later? 3 messages. Each hinting that investigators had overlooked something. Mercer studied the 3rd letter again. You missed the only thing that mattered. 7 words that had haunted him since the envelope arrived. What had they missed? The crime scene had been studied repeatedly. The timeline examined from every angle. The stalker behavior documented. What single detail could matter enough to write about years later? Mercer walked back into the evidence room and requested the physical crime scene items again. Melissa's kitchenware. The wine bottle. The glasses. The broken lamp. Even after years, each object still carried the quiet weight of that night. Technicians had already tested everything for fingerprints and DNA in 2004. But forensic science had improved since then. Mercer ordered the wine bottle and glasses re-examined using newer trace DNA techniques. Sometimes skin cells invisible to earlier testing could be recovered years later. Weeks passed. Then the call came from the lab. A partial DNA profile had been recovered. Not from the bottle, but from the base of the second wine glass. The glass investigators believed belonged to Melissa's visitor. The profile wasn't complete, but it was enough to enter into the national DNA database. Mercer felt a surge of cautious optimism. If Bell had touched that glass, the system might find a match. Days passed. Then weeks. The database returned its answer. No match. The profile did not belong to anyone previously arrested or registered in the system. Mercer stared at the report in silence. If the glass belonged to the killer, then the killer had no prior criminal record. Or had never been required to submit DNA. Which meant Bell was still possible. But not confirmed. And then Mercer noticed one final detail inside the lab report. The DNA profile suggested the person who touched the glass was male. But the sample also showed signs of something unusual. The DNA mixture included trace amounts from a second person. Not Melissa. Someone else. Someone whose genetic markers were incomplete, almost degraded beyond identification. It suggested the glass may have been handled more than once before that night. Which meant one possibility investigators had never fully explored. The glass might not have been brought out specifically for Melissa's visitor. It could have already been sitting on the counter. Used earlier. By someone else. Someone who had been inside Melissa Carter's home before the killer arrived. Mercer leaned back slowly. For years, investigators assumed the second wine glass belonged only to the person who killed her. But what if the glass carried traces from someone else entirely? Someone innocent. Someone overlooked. Someone whose presence in the house that evening had never been properly questioned. Mercer felt the same cold realization creeping into his thoughts that the anonymous letters seemed to imply. Maybe the investigation really had missed something. Not outside the case, but hidden inside it from the very beginning. For years the silence around the case had hardened into something almost physical. In small towns across southern Ohio, people learned to stop talking about it out loud. Not because they forgot, but because the questions had nowhere left to go. Every investigation eventually reaches that point. A moment when the detectives run out of witnesses, the tips stop coming in, the leads collapse one by one until the case file becomes a thick stack of paper sitting inside a steel cabinet. But the difference with this case was the feeling that something had been missed. Something small. Something hiding in plain sight. In 2009, 5 years after the homicide, an investigator assigned to the cold case unit pulled the file back off the shelf. His name was Detective Mark Caldwell. He had spent 2 decades working violent crimes across Ohio, and by the time the file landed on his desk, he had developed the quiet patience that cold case work demands. He knew most unsolved murders never reveal themselves through dramatic confessions or sudden breakthroughs. Instead, they unravel slowly. Piece by piece. Caldwell started where every cold case detective begins, with the original timeline. He reviewed the 911 call. The first officer's report. The photographs taken at the scene. He read the witness statements again and again, searching for contradictions that might have been overlooked during the initial rush of the investigation. The timeline still appeared airtight. Late evening. Victim leaves home. Last sighting near a small stretch of road outside town. Body discovered hours later. No witnesses to the attack. No clear suspect. No murder weapon. But one small detail caught Caldwell's attention. It wasn't something dramatic. It wasn't a new clue. It was a statement that had been filed early in the investigation, then quietly buried among hundreds of pages of reports. A man who lived 2 miles from the scene had told deputies he saw a vehicle parked along the roadside that night. At the time, investigators logged the tip but dismissed it. The description was vague. Dark-colored pickup truck. No plate number. No driver identified. In rural Ohio, that description could match hundreds of vehicles. Still, Caldwell circled the statement in red ink. Because there was something about the timing. The witness had reported seeing the truck around 10:15 p.m. That placed it directly inside the narrow window when the homicide likely occurred. For 5 years, no one had been able to explain how the killer arrived, or how they left the scene. Now Caldwell wondered if the answer had been sitting in the file the entire time. He tracked down the witness again. The man was older now. Slower. But when Caldwell asked about that night, the memory returned with surprising clarity. Yes, the man said. There was a truck. Caldwell asked if he could describe it again. The man closed his eyes. Older model, maybe late 90s. Dark blue or black. Parked with the headlights off. Then he added something that hadn't appeared in the original report. I remember because it was strange. Strange how? Caldwell asked. The man hesitated. The driver was still inside. That detail sent a quiet ripple through the investigation. Caldwell leaned forward. Did you see the driver's face? The witness shook his head. No. Too dark. But he remembered something else. Something subtle. When his own car passed the parked truck, the driver turned slightly toward the road. And for a brief second, the glow from the dashboard illuminated the inside of the cab. I saw a baseball cap, the man said. And a beard. Not a full description. Not enough to identify someone. But after 5 years of silence, even the smallest detail mattered. Caldwell reopened the case officially. Detectives began reviewing vehicle registrations for pickup trucks matching the description, within a 50-mile radius of the crime scene in 2004. The list quickly grew into the thousands. So investigators narrowed the search. Men. Ages 25 to 50 at the time of the homicide. Owners of dark-colored pickup trucks. Residents or workers who regularly traveled through the rural road where the victim had last been seen. Even after filtering the list, there were still hundreds of names. But cold case work thrives on patience. Caldwell began contacting them one by one. Most interviews led nowhere. Drivers who had long since sold their trucks. Men who had moved out of state. People with solid alibis. Weeks turned into months. But then, during one interview, something unexpected happened. A man named Brian Harper, 37 in 2004, became visibly nervous when detectives mentioned the road where the homicide occurred. At first, his answers were calm. Measured. He admitted he owned a dark blue pickup truck back then. But he insisted he rarely drove near that area. Yet as the interview continued, Caldwell noticed the cracks beginning to show. Harper's timeline for that night shifted slightly. First he claimed he was home all evening. Then he mentioned stopping at a gas station. Then suddenly he remembered driving somewhere outside town. The inconsistencies were subtle, but unmistakable. Caldwell didn't accuse him. Not yet. Instead, he asked a simple question. Do you still have that truck? Harper shook his head quickly. Sold it years ago. To who? He didn't remember. When? Maybe 2006 or 2007. The uncertainty hung in the air. Caldwell left the interview with more questions than answers. But now the investigation had a new direction. Detectives began digging into Harper's background. His name had never surfaced during the original homicide investigation. No criminal record. No known connection to the victim. On paper, he looked like an ordinary resident. But neighbors remembered something else. Harper had a reputation for unpredictable behavior. Sudden bursts of anger. Arguments with co-workers. And one disturbing incident reported years earlier, an altercation that had almost turned violent. Nothing that led to charges. Nothing strong enough to make him a suspect. But enough to raise quiet concerns. Caldwell requested phone records from 2004. Back then, cell tower data wasn't as precise as it is today, but it could still place a phone within a general area. The results came back weeks later. Harper's phone had connected to a tower covering the same rural stretch of road on the night of the homicide. The exact time? 10:11 p.m. 4 minutes before the witness saw the truck. It wasn't proof. But it was the closest thing investigators had found in years. The case that once felt frozen in time had started moving again. Detectives prepared to bring Harper back in for another interview. But before they could, something strange happened. Harper suddenly left town. His neighbors said he packed quickly. Within a week, his house was empty. No forwarding address. No explanation. For Caldwell, that disappearance raised the stakes instantly. People move all the time. But the timing felt too perfect. Too sudden. Too convenient. Detectives launched a search across state lines. They checked employment records, credit card activity, vehicle registrations. For months, there was nothing. Then finally, a small trace appeared. A job application submitted in Kentucky. The address listed on the form matched a rural trailer park outside a town called Maysville. Caldwell drove there himself. The trailer park was quiet. Rows of faded homes sitting beneath sagging power lines. When he knocked on the door listed in the records, a woman answered. She looked confused when Caldwell asked for Brian Harper. He moved out, she said. When? Couple months ago. Did he say where he was going? She shook her head slowly. No. Just packed up and left one morning. Once again, the trail went cold. Years passed. Investigators continued searching, but Harper seemed to vanish completely. No new addresses. No employment records. No arrests. No trace. And then, nearly a decade after the homicide, something happened that nobody expected. In 2014, a routine traffic stop in rural West Virginia triggered an alert in the national database. The driver presented a license under a different name. But fingerprints told a different story. The man sitting behind the wheel wasn't who he claimed to be. He was Brian Harper. And when officers realized he was connected to an unsolved homicide in Ohio, the quiet road where the traffic stop occurred suddenly became the center of a decades-old mystery. Back in Ohio, Detective Caldwell received the call late that night. After 10 years of silence, the man who might hold the answers had finally resurfaced. And the next conversation investigators had with him could determine whether the secret behind the Ohio 2004 homicide was about to unravel or disappear forever into the darkness that had protected it for so long. The news reached Ohio before sunrise. A routine traffic stop in West Virginia had pulled a ghost out of the shadows. After nearly a decade of silence, Brian Harper was suddenly back on the radar of law enforcement, sitting in the back of a county patrol car, with a pair of handcuffs around his wrists and a false identity in his pocket. Detective Mark Caldwell received the call just after 4:30 in the morning. For a moment, he simply stared at the phone. Cold cases rarely give investigators second chances. When a suspect disappears for years, the trail usually dies with them. But this time, something had shifted. Harper was alive. And more importantly, he was talking. West Virginia deputies had initially stopped him for a broken taillight. Nothing unusual. A routine traffic stop on a quiet highway cutting through the Appalachian Hills. But when the driver handed over a license under the name Michael Turner, something about the interaction felt off. The man behind the wheel seemed nervous. Not the casual anxiety most drivers show during a traffic stop. This was different. His hands trembled slightly when he passed the license through the window. His voice cracked when he answered simple questions. Deputies ran the name through their system. No outstanding warrants. No alerts. But something still didn't feel right. So they asked him to step out of the vehicle. That was when everything changed. A fingerprint scan, standard procedure in that county, returned a different identity entirely. Brian Harper. And attached to his name was a quiet, but unmistakable note in the national database. Person of interest. Unsolved homicide. Ohio, 2004. Within minutes, the small roadside stop turned into something far more serious. Harper was placed under arrest for providing false identification. But everyone involved understood the real reason investigators would soon be coming for him. Back in Ohio, Caldwell wasted no time. By mid-morning, he was already driving east across the state line with another detective beside him. The highway stretched ahead under a gray sky, miles of winter fields passing silently outside the windshield. Neither man spoke much. After 10 years of chasing fragments of a story, they both understood what this moment could mean. But they also knew how fragile it was. Suspects disappear again. Memories fade. Evidence grows weaker with every passing year. If Harper knew something about the homicide, investigators needed to find out now. Before the trail vanished again. They arrived at the West Virginia County Jail shortly after noon. The building was small, concrete walls, narrow hallways, the smell of disinfectant lingering in the air. A deputy escorted them through a series of locked doors until they reached a quiet interview room. Inside, Brian Harper sat alone at a metal table. He looked older than the photographs from a decade earlier. His beard had gone gray in patches. His shoulders slumped slightly forward. But the eyes were the same, watchful, cautious, measuring every movement around him. For several seconds, no one spoke. Caldwell placed a thin folder on the table and sat down across from him. "You've been hard to find," Caldwell said calmly. Harper stared at the table. "I didn't do anything," he replied quietly. The denial came too quickly. Too automatic. Caldwell didn't challenge him yet. Instead, he slid a photograph across the table. The image showed the rural Ohio road where the homicide occurred, taken on the night investigators reopened the case years earlier. "Do you recognize this place?" Harper glanced at the picture for only a second before looking away. "No." But Caldwell noticed something subtle. The tightening of Harper's jaw. The brief flicker of tension in his eyes. "You owned a dark blue pickup truck in 2004, Caldwell continued. Silence. "You remember that truck?" Harper nodded slowly. "Yeah." Caldwell leaned forward slightly. "A witness saw a truck parked on this road the night someone was killed." Harper's hands rested flat on the table now, fingers interlocked. Still calm. Still quiet. But the tension in the room had changed. "Lots of trucks in Ohio," Harper said. "Sure," Caldwell replied. Then he opened the folder. Inside were documents the suspect had likely never expected investigators to connect. Cell tower records. Witness statements. Old interview transcripts. Caldwell placed them on the table one by one. "Your phone connected to a tower near that road at 10:11 p.m., he said. Harper didn't respond. "You told us in 2009 you weren't near that area." Still silence. Caldwell let the moment stretch. Then he added something new. "The witness said the driver had a beard and a baseball cap." Harper's breathing slowed slightly. "That sound familiar?" For the first time, Harper looked directly at Caldwell. Not with anger. Not with fear. But with something harder to read. Calculation. "You're wasting your time," he said. Caldwell studied him carefully. Cold case interviews often unfold slowly, like a chess match played across hours instead of minutes. Detectives rarely expect a sudden confession. What they watch for instead are the cracks. Small inconsistencies. Moments when the suspect reveals more than intended. Caldwell leaned back in his chair. "You left Ohio pretty quickly after we talked to you," he said. "I moved," Harper replied. "You changed your name." No response. You disappeared for years. Harper shrugged slightly. People move. Caldwell nodded. That's true. Then he placed one final photograph on the table. This one showed the crime scene itself. The wooded edge of the road where the victim had been discovered. Police tape stretched between trees. Flashlights cutting through the darkness. For a long moment, Harper stared at the image. And something shifted. His eyes lingered longer than before. Not the quick glance of someone seeing a place for the first time, but the recognition of someone who had been there. Caldwell saw it immediately. Looks familiar, doesn't it? He asked quietly. Harper's jaw tightened again. But this time, he didn't answer. Minutes passed in silence. The kind of silence that presses heavily against the walls of a room. Finally, Harper spoke again. I want a lawyer. The words ended the interview instantly. Chairs scraped against the floor. The deputy opened the door. And just like that, the conversation stopped. But Caldwell wasn't discouraged. Because even without a confession, the interview had revealed something important. Harper hadn't denied being near the road. He hadn't challenged the cell tower records. And most telling of all, he had reacted to the crime scene photograph. Investigators now had more than just suspicion. They had behavior, reactions, and a timeline that placed Harper dangerously close to the homicide. Back in Ohio, prosecutors began reviewing the case again. But the problem remained the same. Circumstantial evidence alone rarely secures a conviction. After 10 years, physical evidence was limited. The murder weapon had never been found. DNA from the scene was incomplete. And without a witness placing Harper directly at the crime scene, the case still hovered in uncertain territory. Detectives needed something stronger. Something that connected Harper to the victim beyond coincidence. For weeks, investigators combed through Harper's past again. Old friendships. Former co-workers. Family members. Some refused to speak. Others claimed they knew nothing. But eventually, a new name surfaced. A man who had worked with Harper in 2004. A mechanic who remembered something strange from that summer. According to him, Harper had brought his pickup truck into the shop a few days after the homicide. Not for routine maintenance. For something specific. He needed the interior cleaned. Thoroughly. The mechanic remembered it clearly because Harper insisted on removing the seats himself before bringing the truck in. At the time, it seemed odd. But not suspicious enough to question. Now, 10 years later, that memory suddenly felt very different. Investigators tracked down the shop's old service records. Most had been destroyed long ago. But one faded invoice remained in storage. The date matched exactly. 3 days after the homicide. Interior detailing. Full cleaning. Caldwell stared at the document quietly. Because if the truck had been cleaned that aggressively, there was only one reason someone would do that. They were trying to erase something. But what exactly had been inside that truck on the night of the murder remained a mystery. And the only man who knew the answer was now sitting behind bars in another state, silent, patient, and protected by a lawyer. The investigation had come further than anyone expected. But the truth behind the Ohio 2004 homicide still sat just out of reach. And the longer Brian Harper kept his mouth shut, the closer the case drifted back toward the darkness it had lived in for more than a decade. The problem with cold cases is time. Time erodes everything, memories, evidence, even the urgency that once drove an investigation forward. Witnesses move away. Records disappear. Small details that once felt sharp and clear blur into uncertainty. But sometimes time does something else. Sometimes it forces the truth closer to the surface. Back in Ohio, Detective Mark Caldwell sat inside the cold case office long after the building had emptied for the night. The fluorescent lights hummed quietly above him while the thick case file lay open across his desk. Photographs. Reports. Witness statements. Years of investigation reduced to paper. But now, for the first time in more than a decade, there was a living suspect sitting in a jail cell. Brian Harper. Caldwell flipped slowly through the documents again, stopping on the mechanic's statement. The man's memory of cleaning Harper's truck 3 days after the homicide had become one of the most important details uncovered since the case was reopened. Because it raised a dangerous possibility. If the truck had been used during the crime, then traces of evidence might have once existed inside it. Blood. Fibers. DNA. All of it potentially erased during that aggressive cleaning. But erased didn't always mean gone forever. Caldwell contacted forensic specialists to review what little evidence had been preserved from the original investigation. Back in 2004, the victim's clothing had been collected and stored carefully. At the time, testing technology had been far more limited. But forensic science had changed dramatically in the years since. Even microscopic traces could now reveal new answers. The clothing was sent back to the lab. Weeks passed. Then one afternoon, the call finally came. A forensic analyst had found something investigators in 2004 could not have detected. A small collection of fibers embedded in the fabric. Dark blue. Synthetic. The type commonly used in automotive upholstery. The discovery didn't prove the victim had been inside Harper's truck. But it suggested the possibility. And in a case with almost no physical evidence, even the smallest connection mattered. Prosecutors began discussing their options carefully. Charging someone with murder required more than suspicion. They needed a narrative. A timeline that made sense. A story a jury could believe. And that story still had gaps. Back in West Virginia, Brian Harper remained quiet. His lawyer had advised him not to answer questions. No interviews. No statements. No cooperation. But silence can be dangerous too. Because while Harper waited in his cell, investigators kept digging. Detectives began mapping his life in 2004 with microscopic detail. Where he worked. Where he drank. Who he spent time with. Where he traveled on weekends. Bit by bit, a picture began to form. Harper had worked construction that year, often driving between small towns across southern Ohio. His job required long hours on the road, sometimes late into the evening. That explained why his truck might have been seen on a rural road after dark. But it didn't explain why he had lied about being there. And it didn't explain why he had disappeared years later. Caldwell traveled back to the town where Harper once lived and started speaking with people who had known him back then. Most described him the same way. Quiet. Private. A man who kept to himself. But a few remembered something darker. A former co-worker described Harper's temper as unpredictable. He could snap, the man said. Not often. But when he did it was bad. Another acquaintance recalled an argument Harper once had in a bar. The fight never turned violent, but witnesses said Harper had looked ready to explode. None of it proved he was capable of murder. But it added another layer to the story investigators were building. Then Caldwell found something that made him pause. An old police report from 2003. 1 year before the homicide. It documented a domestic disturbance call involving Harper and a girlfriend. No charges were filed. The woman refused to cooperate with officers. But the responding deputy had written something in the report that stood out. Male subject appeared agitated and aggressive. Caldwell tracked down the woman listed in the report. It took weeks. She had moved twice since 2004. But eventually, detectives found her living in a quiet neighborhood outside Columbus. At first, she refused to speak. The past was something she had clearly tried to leave behind. But when Caldwell mentioned the unsolved homicide, her expression changed. "You think Brian had something to do with that?" she asked quietly. "We're trying to understand what happened," Caldwell replied. She hesitated before answering. "Brian wasn't a good person when he got angry." Her voice carried the kind of certainty that only comes from experience. "He could turn cold. Like a switch flipped." Caldwell asked if Harper had ever mentioned the rural road where the victim was last seen. She shook her head. But then she remembered something else. One night in late summer 2004, only weeks after the homicide, Harper had come home extremely late. Later than usual. He looked shaken. Not drunk. Not angry. Just different. "He kept washing his hands," she said. Over and over. Caldwell felt the tension in the room rise slightly. "Did he say why?" She shook her head again. "No. But something was wrong." That small memory became another piece in the growing puzzle. Not proof, but behavior. And behavior can speak loudly in courtrooms. Meanwhile, Harper remained locked in a quiet jail cell hundreds of miles away. Days passed. Then weeks. And eventually his lawyer arranged for a formal interview with Ohio investigators. Not because Harper wanted to confess, but because he wanted to control the narrative. The meeting took place inside a secure interview room at the county jail. This time, Harper's attorney sat beside him. Caldwell entered the room carrying a thicker folder than before. The case had grown. More statements. More evidence. More questions. Harper looked calm. Almost detached. "You've been busy," he said when Caldwell placed the file on the table. "We've been working," Caldwell replied. The lawyer leaned forward slightly. "My client is willing to answer some questions. But there were conditions. No accusations. No aggressive interrogation. Just questions." Caldwell nodded. Then he began. "Were you driving your truck near the rural road outside town on the night of July 18, 2004? Harper hesitated. A long pause filled the room. Finally he answered. "Maybe." The word echoed quietly. For the first time, Harper had placed himself near the scene. "Why were you there?" Caldwell asked. Harper shrugged slightly. "Just driving. At 10 o'clock at night. I liked driving." Caldwell studied him carefully. "Did you see anyone on that road?" Harper shook his head. "No." "Did you pick anyone up?" "No." "Did you argue with anyone?" "No." The lawyer watched every question closely. Every answer was measured. Controlled. But Caldwell wasn't finished. He placed another photograph on the table. This one showed the victim. Taken long before the homicide. Smiling. Alive. "Have you ever seen this person before?" Harper glanced at the image briefly. No. The denial came instantly. Too quickly. And Caldwell noticed something again. That same tightening in Harper's jaw. A flicker of recognition he tried to hide. But there was still no confession. No admission. Just fragments of a story that refused to fully reveal itself. When the interview ended, Caldwell walked out of the jail feeling both closer and farther from the truth. Closer because Harper had finally admitted being near the scene. Farther because the final piece, the moment when suspicion turns into proof, remained just beyond reach. Outside, the evening air was cold and still. Caldwell stood beside his car for a long moment, staring at the darkening sky. Somewhere inside that jail sat a man who might know exactly what happened on a lonely Ohio road in 2004. A man who might know why a life ended in violence. A man who had spent 10 years running from the questions. But eventually, every story reaches the point where silence becomes harder to maintain than the truth. And Caldwell believed that moment was getting closer. Because pressure was building. Evidence was growing. And sooner or later, Brian Harper would have to decide whether he wanted to keep carrying the weight of that night alone.